We are so happy today to have with us a speaker of a very interesting topic, and our speaker is very experienced in this area. It's Dr. Gio Piza, or as I think you like to be called, Gio. Gio was formally trained as a general practitioner back in his home country in Bogota, Colombia. And Gio, you moved to Canada in 2001. And I think you've been with Princess Margaret almost ever since. You joined the Princess Margaret Cancer Center multiple myeloma program in July of 2002 as a clinical research coordinator. Gio currently is the senior clinical research manager of the multiple myeloma and related disease clinical trials group. So myeloma has their own group of healthcare professionals, mostly nurses, but others who look after the many trials that Princess Margaret conducts for myeloma. And Gio is the head of that group. For some of you who have taken part in trials, the clinical trial nurses, Gio is their boss and keeps them. It really is a very excellent team of professionals. And you graduated from the University of Toronto, Joint Center of Bioethics in 2018 with a Master of Health Sciences in Bioethics. So in addition to being a fully qualified doctor, at least in Colombia, and a practicing doctor, you've got this additional accreditation. And that, I think, is quite a focus of your interest in research ethics with emphasis in informed consent in clinical research. So this topic is very important, in my view, for myeloma patients. Many of us will have an opportunity to take part in a clinical trial at Princess Margaret or some other cancer center where you might be treated. This can be an opportunity to receive treatments that are not otherwise available. You'll get the best of care. But it is quite a process. So again, we are so fortunate to have Gio taking the time to prepare quite an extensive presentation and his very full schedule to come with us here today. So with that in mind, would you please join me in giving Gio a most warm welcome.
Thank you very much to all of you for having me today. I'm really, really honored to have this opportunity. As David said, I started my career in clinical research about 21 years ago with the Multiple Myeloma Clinical Trials Group. And we were really two people leading that group at that point. And I've been going through the past 21 years on different roles. And it is really, really, I feel fortunate to have seen how much clinical research has changed in the past decade. So much going on, but it's all probably because of patients like you, very engaged and committed to help others. And so again, I'm very honored to be given this opportunity to share those experiences with you today, of course. From the clinical trial point of view, but also from the perspective of a patient during their journey in multiple myeloma. All right, so let's start. So I think in terms of any disclosures, I don't have any financial disclosures. As David mentioned, I was trained as a GP back in Colombia. I'm not a licensed physician in Canada. I work as a clinical research manager at Princess Margaret, and I'm mainly focused this time in operations for clinical trials. This is just a presentation outline, so we're gonna have a break halfway through, probably around 30 minutes of my presentation, so we can probably stretch a little bit. When I was invited to give this talk, Dave communicated with me some topics of interest that have been gathered mainly from you, your friends and relatives. And when I started looking at them, I kind of grouped them, and I started seeing that some things are, came out of me doing that exercise. And then right away I started seeing that, okay, what I have seen in terms of the key points of interest or questions that you might have shared with the support group, I start seeing that almost like a journey, like some kind of road that most of you, if you are interested or if you have been approached to consider participation in clinical trial, will go through as part of your myeloma journey. So that's exactly what I did. So I hope that you find this talk informative. It's intended to kind of make you aware of what things or topics we should pay a little bit more attention when we are being asked or interested in participating in a clinical trial. So we're gonna look up the objectives of this presentation. Dr. Christine Shen, one of our clinicians, investigators, had the opportunity to give a talk to the support group back on April the 1st this year. So I wanna, kind of recap on that talk, specifically on the comments and information that she shared about clinical trials, which is just small, and that's the reason, again, I'm here today, probably expand a little bit more on that. Of course, I would like to go through some basic definitions that are relevant to clinical research or clinical trials. So hopefully that helped you and helped me, again, establish some conversation today about potential participation in clinical trial. Because again, that's the next item on the outline. It's just, again, a little bit of how we can help you potentially in your journey of participation in a clinical trial and what resources you might have. As David mentioned, I have an interest in clinical research, specifically from the ethical point of view, and informed consent process is one of my areas of interest. And when I was grouping all these key topics of interest, I realized a lot of them fit within the informed consent process. So I want to dedicate a little bit more of time for my presentation on this topic. And then probably at that point is where I would like to suggest that we have a break, and then I'll come back and probably we can start specifically looking at the different steps once you have decided to participate in a trial, what's involved. So from the screening and eligibility point of view, to the enrollment process itself, what we consider a baseline and why it is important to have that baseline, through your monitoring and follow-up throughout the participation in the clinical trial. Also, we're gonna touch upon a little bit on what's involved at the end of a trial, or early termination, or withdrawing from a trial participation, and try to understand what the differences are with those approaches. We also, or I'll probably discuss just before I finish my talk, a little bit about the interim and then the final report in clinical trials, and probably, again, where it's important that you get all this information about the trial that you participate in, and other friends or relatives as well, and then try to understand what that means to you. And then finally, we'll just have some opportunity to have some questions, and I'm happy, hopefully, to be able to address those. So that's the plan for today. So again, I wanted to see all this outline more like a journey once you decide to participate. So the objectives of this presentation, basically, I wanna review clinical research basic terminology and definitions, tailored to patients, their relatives, and friends. I want to navigate patients through the clinical trial journey. I want to review different key components and steps that are involved when the patient participates in a clinical trial from the patient's perspective. And I want to address any potential questions from the audience, in this case you, related to clinical trials, which is what I'm passionate about. So in terms of the recap from Dr. Christine Chen's talk back on April the 1st, her talk was actually what's new in myeloma and updates from ASH. Again, she wanted just to focus mainly on what kind of new treatments and updates we had on those conferences that we usually attend annually, where we present and discuss updates on clinical research that we perform. And then she did talk a little bit about 4 key points at the beginning of her talk, about how to get a new treatment or new drugs to patients, the phases of the clinical trials, some research terminology, and how to get you on a trial. So I would like to, again, just quickly go over what you mentioned about how we get new treatments to patients, and then as a background and understanding why it's so key that we do clinical trials. So Dr. Chen began by explaining that we have mainly 3 different stages to get drugs or new therapies to patients. So one is the discovery stage, the second one is the development stage, and then the delivery. So in the discovery stage, it's just basically we have new ideas, basic research labs, scientists who have probably discovered some activity on new molecules that probably have impact on some pathways affecting specifically myeloma cells. So it's all an idea. They do some basic research, and then translational groups, if they see some efficacy on those new molecules, then probably they'll start working on translating these into clinical research. So clinical research is just when we involve human beings in the research process. So initially it's just in vitro research or in vitro research that we conduct, and then if we see some signaling, we move into animal models. But then once we identify the molecule be safe to test in humans, we move into the clinical research component of development, which can take years as well. And this is where we can see the different phases that she mentioned in the past: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and those that we call phase 4 or post-marketing. So we're going to talk a little bit quickly on this, as she has explained before, and some main components of this type of phases of the clinical trial. And then once we have all the safety and efficacy data, safety, we assess to make sure that it's safe to give this new drug or therapies, and then the efficacy, making sure that the combination of the drugs or the single drug actually has some activity in treating multiple myeloma. Then we move into providing this data to the regulatory agencies, which review this information and assess if the new drug or therapies are approved and safe enough to give to our patients. And then it's just marketed and then approved and provided access to our patients. So that's in short a little bit of the whole cycle. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the development component of this process, which is where we have the clinical trials. In terms of the drug development, so this is again where I mentioned to you before we move into clinical research, we have in vitro and animal testing, and then we have the specific phases of the trial. And after a drug is approved, and then we could still have some trials or studies conducted as part of the post-marketing surveillance. Now, in terms of the phases of the trial, she did share these slides with her presentation, and it just to illustrate a little bit of what differences we have for the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials and what entitled. So for the phase 1 trial, again, we want to look at the safety profile of a new molecule or combination of therapies, and then we want to make sure that we also assess what is the most or the safest dose that we can administer to our patients. Usually there are small trials. The sample size is about 20 to 40 patients. They tend to last a couple of months, a year or so. Although with the complexity of the trials that we have seen phase 1 trials that could last longer than months, even years. We also want to, with the phase 1, identify different dose levels that we can administer the new drug or new combination of drugs to our patients, and always is focused on safety more than efficacy. Phase 2 trials once we have identified that a molecule or a combination of therapies are safe to give to our patients, then we want to study Further, if they are safe at the dose that we have identified that is safe to give to our patients. So we collect more safety data, but in phase 2, we want to know now if those new molecules or combination of drugs are effective to treat myeloma. So we assess efficacy in phase 2 trials, and usually it's more than one center involved. But as I said before, we are seeing now many centers involved doing the phase 1 trial, the same phase 1 trial, because you would just want to make sure that we accelerate the research component by recruiting different sites where we can have different cohorts or those levels where we enroll these patients, our patients. And then phase 3 trials, once we have identified that it's safe and we have seen that it's effective to treat myeloma, we want to compare now that new drug or new therapy with what we have already approved as a standard of care. So in oncology, it's very rare that we do placebo trials, where we usually compare or comparator arms are standard of care treatment. So patients at minimum will have their standard of care treatment, and then we compare with new molecule or the new therapy. And then that's where it takes a little bit more of a greater sample size. So we're talking about hundreds or thousands of patients. There are multiple sites involved in conducting these phase 3 trials. And in this case, we use randomized groups or, where the investigator and the patient might not know exactly which group they will be allocated to. This is to avoid bias, and then we can have blind or double-blind trials. And what that means is that blind trials, a single blind means that the patient doesn't know what treatments they're getting, but the investigators might know. And a double-blind, the patient doesn't know, the investigator doesn't know what kind of treatments they're getting once they're randomized. Now, this is just a cartoon that Dr. Chen shared last time, and it was just to kind of showcase and illustrate a little bit of the complexity of our trial. This is just a study design for a phase 3 trial where we compare standard of care to the new arm, and then what's involved in terms of what are we trying to learn from it and what we're trying to assess. So the primary endpoints, where the groups involved, and some of the the specifications around dose administration. So this is just again to illustrate a little bit of the complexity of our randomized trials. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so now in the last component of her talk was about how to get into a clinical trial. So you can definitely ask your myeloma team. That was some kind of a summary of her presentation too at the beginning. She touched upon about discussing a little bit of screening activities from the eligibility point of view, and just reassuring patients and the relatives and friends that eligibility these days can be a little bit picky and very selective, so don't be discouraged if you don't meet eligibility. But we're going to touch upon a little bit later on the specific screening activities. Overview of the study, something that what I find is where you're going to get the most information from your study doctor or your research team. This is the opportunity you have to ask many, many questions. Never mind the consent process itself. It's a process, and you have the opportunity to discuss any questions, doubts that you might have throughout your participation in the study with your study team. And again, she talked about the consent forms. These are just documents that are given to you, hard copies for the most part for you to read at home, review with friends and relatives, and even other physicians as well. In terms of the questions to ask, these are some of the questions that Dr. Chen found relevant for you to ask when you're potentially considering participation in a clinical trial. We're going to go through those in more detail when we review the informed consent process. I just wanted to show some of the comments and recommendations she made around this component of the clinical trial participations. Okay. So again, from those 4 key points, I want to expand a little bit more on the research terminology, something basic but important for you to also understand. And how did you get, again, on participating in a clinical trial? So in terms of the definitions, I want to go through a definition of a clinical trial. What is a clinical trial? Why do we do clinical trials? What are the objectives and endpoints of a clinical trial? Why are they important? How long trials could last? What is the difference between an interventional or clinical trial versus a non-interventional study? Because again, as a patient going through the myeloma journey, you might be able to participate not only in those studies that give you an intervention or clinical trials, but those that you might not get an intervention, but you might be able to contribute to the research by providing some blood samples or tissue samples that can help us understand a little bit more on tests that we can use for myeloma, new drugs or new molecules that we can develop. And also we want to understand what type of trials are out there, those industry sponsored or supported, those done through networks, like in Canada we have the Canadian Myeloma Research Group or the Canadian Clinical Trials Group, and those done directly from academic institutions like Princess Margaret, where we have our own investigator-initiated trials. Okay, so before I start with the definition of what's a clinical trial, I just want, or the point of this slides is just to let everybody know that clinical research in Canada is really kind of guided by the Tri-Council policy statement. It's just an ethical conduct policy that, again, guide clinicians, researchers, and institutions where the research is going on how we can and what is required for us to do clinical research. So these are the agencies, are the three major agencies that support research in Canada when they're publicly funded, specifically and for the most part on the lab research and the preclinical research. So those are the Canadian Institute of Health Research, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. All of them are known as the agency, and in order for you to get a grant approved, if you apply for it, so get some funding, you need to follow this policy. So the policy defined a clinical trial as an investigation involving participants that evaluates effects of one or more health-related interventions. So in other words, an intervention is planned imposition of a condition or set of conditions that we give or provide to a patient and we assess. So it's basically a scientific investigation to assess the safety and the efficacy of an intervention. In this case, we're going to focus on drugs or clinical trials, and that's the intervention. So that's a clinical trial. So why do we do the clinical trial? So basically it's to evaluate those interventions. So usually there are new interventions, new drugs, or combinations of new interventions that we don't know if, again, they are safe, first of all, and they're has some efficacy in terms of being able to treat, in this case, myeloma. So usually the researcher is a leading clinician or investigators, but it could be a physician, it could be a dentist, a nurse, a physiotherapist conducting the research. And I also wanted to, again, probably make you aware of a term that we use in clinical research that is called the therapeutic misconception. And I do know that the last thing that we want to lose as a patients, relatives or friends of patients going through the myeloma journey is hope. So, but we do want to make sure that when you are considering participating in a clinical trial, you understand that sometimes we might not get any benefit from participating in a clinical trial or direct benefit from it. So the intent of the clinical trial, of course, is hopefully, bridge some gaps and provide opportunities to have access to new drugs that are not necessarily approved, but it's not necessarily secure to say that those interventions will have a benefit. And when the patient doesn't understand that, that's what we call about a little bit of the therapeutic misconception. So we believe that the trial will give us a therapeutic benefit when in reality might not be the case. But what I want to reassure everybody is by participating in a clinical trial or in clinical research, again, in the future, other patients might benefit from your contribution. So that's another point that I wanted to emphasize. And in terms of the clinical trial registration, so as I mentioned before, there's so much clinical research going on these days that we don't want to duplicate efforts, and we want to make sure that we collaborate. So there are clinical trial registers that are intended to, again, register trials, and with the idea to prevent also results not to be published. So because we want to make sure that any outcome of a clinical trial is published, whether it's favorable outcome or not necessarily, we want to make sure that we can learn from it. So those are important considerations that we need to keep in mind when we talk about clinical trials. So other considerations in terms of the clinical trial from the patient perspective, and as you get more engaged in potentially assessing your participation, is try to understand what's the design of a trial. You know, why are we doing this trial and what's in there for me? So a good way to understand what a trial is being designed or done is just because we want to have clarity on the objective. So what is it, or why are we doing the research? And then usually the objectives are linked to an endpoint, which is a measure of an outcome. So we want to, let's say if we want to assess progression-free survival or the time in between remissions for a patient with a medication or as part of a trial, then the outcome is how long, you know, these patients are in remission with the medication that we're giving. So that's how we're going to measure probably how successful is that. So that's important for you to keep in mind. And we're going to focus during the consent process, all the different components of it, a little bit more where you can ask specifically questions around the study design. So another point of interest or questions that I received from the support group is how long do trials last? And this is, again, it varies. As I mentioned before with the phases of a clinical trial, we talk about phase 1 trials, they tend to be short. Phase 2 trials, they last more, sometimes years, and then phase 3 trials can actually last a little bit longer. But also, depending what outcomes we want to measure or endpoints, we're going to understand a little bit how a trial that we've been asked to participate or we are interested to participate might last. If I'm reading that we're going to assess, again, going back to the progression-free survival, and then we're going to assess that for a fixed period of time, so 5 years, then we're going to know that at least we're going to be follow up for 5 years or until the myeloma is no longer controlled by the medication that we'll be given as part of the study trial or the clinical trial. So those are considerations that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking how long the trial might last. But usually during the consent process, we'll have the opportunity to have a better understanding for that specific trial, how long is expected that we participate in that trial and what is required from us. In terms of other important definitions, so we've been talking about clinical trials and sometimes we talk about studies, so it gets a little bit confusing because we don't know what's the difference between a clinical trial and what's another study. So I like to start by differentiating what is interventional study is that one that gives you by itself, you know, the name it says an intervention, and we want to assess how safe and if it's and if this new intervention might be active to treat myeloma, so assess efficacy. So we give an intervention. And when it's a study drug, so we call it, of course, clinical trials. But there are some other studies that we don't give an intervention. We administer service, or we do other assessments like frailty assessments or walking tests. and not necessarily a study drug. Or sometimes we collect blood samples or bone marrow samples, and that are going to be used to do some more research. So in this case, when an intervention is now given to the patient, we call about non-interventional studies. But just to differentiate, the rest of the talk will be focused on clinical trials. So those studies that we get an intervention given to our study participants. And finally, as part of the definitions, we want to understand what, where and when we talk about industry-sponsored trials or network-sponsored trials or investigator-initiated trials. So it depends on who initiates really and leads the research. So if the study protocol is being developed by pharmaceutical companies, so this is an industry-sponsored trial. Sometimes we have network, like in Canada, like the Canadian Myeloma Research Group, where clinicians also develop their own protocols, and the participating sites, as part of the network, conduct the trial. So these are network-sponsored sites. And then we have those investigator-initiated trials are basically led by the academic site, by the investigators, and for the most part, those could be a single or multi-center site. So when, depending on the sort of source of funding or in the sample size, an investigator-initiated trial can be also, again, a single site or multiple sites. We have currently a trial at Princess Margaret that is being done across 10 participating sites, and we are leading that project. So it's an investigator-initiated trial that has been conducted across Canada. So those are kind of the basic definitions and differentiations that I wanted to make before we move into the next part of the talk, which is how we get information about how we can participate in clinical trials. So who will we contact? I want to also share a little bit of how we're structured, our Princess Margaret, our multiple myeloma clinical trials group, and what our team does. So definitely, usually your attending physician and clinical care team are probably the best resources that you might have initially when you are facing a diagnosis of multiple myeloma, or you are at a stage where you will require another type of treatment, and then you're probably being approached to participate in a clinical trial. So if you have not, but you're interested, again, your attending physician or attending the clinical care team, it's a good resource for you to approach and ask about what kind of trials are right now open for enrollment at your site, the site where you're being looked after and providing care. Of course, groups like this one, the patient support group, are super key and very important for you as a resource, for you to establish those connections and ask questions about potential trial, what's involved. And again, this is just an example of what we're doing today, through the support group. It's just talking a little bit more about clinical trials. Regulatory agencies like Health Canada, the Food and Drug Administration, and the European Medicines Agency are the regulatory agencies in Canada and the States and in Europe. And the website usually do have some information about clinical trials and how to participate and what's required from you as a prospective study participant. Trial registers, as I mentioned before, one of them being clinicaltrials.gov, is another resource, not only for researchers, but also for patients and their relatives and friends as a prospective research participants, because they list some of the trials that we're conducting with regular updates that we as participating sites or leading sponsors need to update on the research that we conduct. Of course, advertisements and media are the ways for you to learn about participation in clinical trial and what's available for you in a specific targeted diseases. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies leading some research or clinical trials and their websites, there should be, and there are usually information about the trials that they are leading. So those are just some examples of resources that you can use to get some information about clinical trials. So at Princess Margaret, we have a dedicated clinical research group or clinical trials group. It's a large group. I think it's one of the largest group at Princess Margaret doing clinical trials. So we have 9 dedicated clinicians, scientifics, 2 of them having their own basic lab research. We have 6 dedicated clinical research nurses who are only specifically working for multiple myeloma and related clinical trials. And 1 dedicated clinical research coordinator supporting the nurses on administrative components, but also supporting nurses on assessments for patients. So it's a large group. And then we have 26 team members, including myself, as part of the different teams that we have in our program. So we have data and regulatory management teams. We have a dedicated database and correlatives teams. We have a non-interventional and central lab portfolio led by a supervisor. We have our own finance and budgetary team. We have a dedicated group of coordinators just focusing on starting up our clinical trials. Again, we do have a large pipeline, which is great. We are a referral site, so we have actually patients being referred to us, but we have also, or we usually are approached, or clinicians, investigators are approached with studies or trials that are being led by pharmaceutical companies or other networks. So we are usually at our side leading and working and participating in clinical trials that are quite relevant and current for our myeloma patients. And of course, the management and team. So in my next slide, I just want to quickly, it's a little bit complex, but it's just to show you our organizational structure in our group. So we belong to the Department of Medical and Oncology and Hematology at Princess Margaret, and we are part of the Cancer Clinical Research Unit. So that's on the top. Dr. Donna Rees, some of you might know her. She's our program director. And then I'm the Senior Clinical Research Manager of the Clinical Trials Group. We do have 5 supervisors, which lead 6 of our major components of our portfolio, as I mentioned to you before. And we work closely with our investigators on the left side, and then our clinical research nurses on the right side. And they don't report to me, they report to the clinical research nurse manager, and who are part of also the Cancer Clinical Research Unit. So it's a very structured group. We continue to grow. And again, I just feel fortunate that 21 years ago when we started, we were only 2 people, and now we have such a large and dedicated group who can provide and work closely with you, your friends and relatives on your participation in clinical trials.
Gio, where are you?
I'm here, actually right in the middle. I'm sorry that the cursor is not showing, but I'm the manager of the Multiple Myeloma Clinical Trials Group, so I manage a lot of the operations of the clinical trials for sure. Yeah, I'm using here the cursor, but it's not showing over there. My apologies for that. So how to participate in a clinical trial? So as part of what we do, we are, again, as I mentioned to you, we have our own investigator-initiated lead research. So we have basic lab research, the one that is done in vitro in cells, animal models as well, and some of the correlatives, the studies that are done over there. Those are studies where if you have participated in a clinical trial, we ask for you to provide additional samples, or we collect some extra samples from your blood or bone marrows. So usually it's to perform correlative studies or more research on those cells. We do have, or we do retrospective or chart review research in our group. So we go back and review our medical charts or electronic medical records, and we try to identify information that we want to explore. We also have 2 dedicated research databases, one of them for myeloma patients, and that's part of the national database, the Canadian Myeloma Research Group database. We also conduct non-interventional studies that are prospective. So from the moment that we consent a patient to participate, and then we start learning as time progresses, not retrospectively like we do with the medical charts. Some examples of those sort of non-interventional studies are service or quality of life studies, assessments like frailty assessments for clinical trials, and again, correlative studies. And then clinical interventional research or trials, clinical trials, where we focus on a study, a drug, an investigational product, or a combination of some of them. And then we do conduct academic or network sponsored research, those led by the Canadian Myeloma Research Group, the Multiple Myeloma Research Consortium in the States, the International Myeloma Foundation, among others, and other academic institutions or hospitals. And then those industry-sponsored research, like pharmaceutical companies, usually they partner with clinical research organizations or groups that help them manage and conduct the trials, because again, the complexity these days in clinical trials is it's out there, so it's complex. So this is just a quick. I just wanted to share with you a little bit of our group, in terms of our metrics from 2022, just to show a little bit in terms of volumes that we work around the research that we do. So we had in 22 open 70. Projects combine 59 interventional studies and 11 non-interventional studies at different phases of the studies, phase 1, 1, 2, phase 2, phase 3 trials, and those expanded access programs as well. So we participated in those. And we were able to enroll 3 new patients in 2022, 82 participating in interventional studies and 218 on non-interventional studies. So you will see here that the efforts and your participation in clinical research, not only for the trials dedicated to have a drug given to you, but also we rely in the support that you provide for correlative studies, for basic research, and we really, really need your support on providing additional samples or tissue that will help our clinicians or lab researchers develop new molecules or interventions. And also, at certain point in 2022, we have 972 active patients. So those were 787 participating in non-interventional studies and 183 patients participating in interventional studies, including, of course, those receiving active treatment. But once you decide to participate in a trial, your participation doesn't necessarily stop when you stop taking the medication. Usually we want to follow our patients and for a specific time of periods, if it's, again, to know for how long they've been responding to the medication, so progression-free survival, or times that they are in remission, and then overall survival, those patients that are still, of course, alive after a fixed period of time. Usually in an oncology setting, we use 5 years as a fixed period for overall survival. It doesn't mean that we expect patients to live shorter or longer than 5 years. It's just usually a fixed time period to have consistency in how we report data. So here is what I would like to focus a little bit more in the whole process or journey through the clinical trial participation. After this presentation on the consent form, we're going to have a break for you to be able to stretch. But it was during this consent process, or what it is, that I identified the key points or questions that the support group shared with me. So that's what I want to focus a little bit of my presentation on, what it is, the consent form, and what's involved. So the informed consent is actually a process by which a subject voluntarily confirms his or her willingness to participate in a particular trial after having been informed all of aspects of the trial that are relevant to the subject's decision to participate. And the informed consent is documented by means of written, signed, and dated informed consent form. So what I have done here is just really bold the basic or general principles for the informed consent process. It has to be, and I have them here. So, of course, your participation in a clinical trial is totally voluntary. So, and at any time during the participation in a clinical trial, you can change your mind. Sometimes we are afraid to say, well, I'm interested right now, but what if later on I don't want to participate in a clinical trial? So it's an ongoing process, so you have the right to decide if you don't want to continue participating for one or another reason. Of course, your research team, if you're working closely with them, will understand why and will try to support your decision and will try to actually help you if we believe that you will potentially benefit from continue with the study participation. We'll try to help you make sure that you're able to comply with the requirements of the trial. So that's what is important, that we communicate and you communicate closely with your research team. The consent also has to be an informed process. You have to understand that in order for you to make a very important decision in your journey and myeloma journey, you have to have all the information that you need to make that decision. So if you have any questions, you need to have those questions addressed. So don't be afraid to ask any questions when you're being approached to participate in a clinical trial, because for us it's very important, and it only tells us that you're engaged in what we're trying to propose to you, or if you're interested and you're approaching us, a good way for you to answer the questions that you might have about a potential clinical trial participation. And of course, it's an ongoing process, so the consent process doesn't stop when you sign the consent form, where you say, okay, now I'm going to participate in the trial, I decided, let's sign the consent form. It doesn't end over there. It's an ongoing process, because throughout the study, as a researchers, our group will understand and will learn new information as we receive interim information about whether it's the investigational product or new drug or combinations of those drugs as part of a therapy. So we can learn about new information, safety information that comes up as patients are moving forward in the treatment. We can also learn the same thing about potentially disease responses to that particular treatment. So when we receive this information, what we do, or our group does, is we amend or revise the consent form that you've been given to and that you've been going through to consent with the new information. So we have also the opportunity to sit down again with you in the clinics and then discuss what are the changes or the new information that we have received or learned from the study that you may be participating, or your loved ones. So, and of course, the other and final principle is it has to be documented. Although I have to say, during the past couple of years, during the pandemic, we have to also become very innovative and adapt to the circumstances and understand that in-person meetings couldn't happen. So we have the opportunity to discuss the consent form through phone calls, via email, and then later on document the consent process. And all this, of course, is usually assessed by the Research Ethics Board, or a group of people that, from the ethical point of view, are there to assess if it's safe to conduct the research that we're proposing. So what to ask during the consent process? So what I did is I took a template from the Research Ethics Board at UHN, where we belong to Princess Margaret, and kind of use the title. So what I'll do is I'll go through it quickly, and then every information in it is really relevant and important. So for instance, in the study title, it will tell you in a summary, you know, what kind of research it is, if it's a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, if everyone is going to get the medication or not. The investigational or the investigator or study doctor is good to know. You may probably have an understanding who this person is. Is this person person with experience? Where is this research being done? Who is the sponsor of this study? So this information is usually documented in the consent form. And as part of the introduction, again, there is this template language already specific for that component in our institution, where we want to reemphasize on the general principles of the consent process, which again, is totally voluntary, your participation. You can take as much time as you need in order to make that informed decision. Of course, in the oncology setting, sometimes we don't have that much time. Time is really precious. So we want to make sure that you work closely with your research team and set up meetings, have phone calls, emails, anything that you need to reach out to your clinical research team to be able to answer the questions that you might have in order for you to make the decision to participate in the clinical trial or not. So for instance, these are just some sort of the questions that you need to ask yourself, what kind of a type of trial is this? The moment that we say a trial, we know that is an intervention that is given to you. So we're not talking about non-interventional studies. We're talking about an intervention that is given to you. The type of investigational product. So what kind of a study drug is that? Is that a new molecule that has not been studied before? Or is the first time that it's going to be studied? Is this a phase 1 study? Is this drug being given orally, or is it going to be given through your veins? Do I need to be on site? The schedule of events of a trial is also a good tool for you to understand what's involved from your participation in a clinical trial. Where is it that those visits are going to happen? What type of visits? Any cost or time commitments, any extra burdens for you as a study participant that you need to be aware in order for you to decide whether you want to participate or not. And again, we'll go through that quickly. As I mentioned before, is there any need for me to go to the hospital? How often do I need to go to the hospital? Or I can take the medication at home. How I will need to see my team, research team, how often, every month, twice per week, and so on. The duration of the trial, again, we talk about that. It will probably be linked to the type of trial that you're going to be participating on, or that you're considering to participate on, like the phase of the trial. Is there any benefit for me? It's a question that a lot of people do ask themselves. Is there an opportunity for me to get some benefit with this treatment? Has any other type of study be done on those new drugs? Anything that you can, again, ask during the consent process, it is important because it will provide clarity to you in terms of your interest in participating. And what about other myeloma patients' benefits in the future? As I said to you, a lot of the non-interventional studies, but also a lot of the clinical trials, we might not have a direct benefit from it, from our participation, but rest assured that patients in the future will have, because this is how we learn, this is how we get new knowledge, and this is how we move forward research. Where we are today, if it wasn't for the patients that participate in clinical trials 10 years ago, we wouldn't have so many opportunities to have targeted therapies these days, like we were talking before about CAR T cells and having access to those drugs, where before we couldn't even thought about that. It wasn't really in our heads to think about some specific type of therapy like that, and because of ongoing clinical research, this is where we are at this point. So again, those questions will fit within the different components of the consent form. And what is going to happen is when you're approached to participate in a clinical trial, they're going to give you a document, the consent form, with all this information. So it's a lot of information for you to process. So bring it home. Take as much time as you need to go through it. Take notes. Ask questions. Ask questions to your primary care providers, your general physicians, your nurse team, friends who have been participating in clinical trials as well, other patients through support groups like this one, about their experience of participating in clinical trials. Because we want to see and pay a specific attention to the risk of participating in a clinical trial. So any medication that we talk, whether it's approved or not, will have some potential side effects or adverse events, but we need to be aware of those, and that's what is important, that when you're considering a new trial, you ask those questions, what are the risks? So when you see, even when you receive a standard of care treatment and you're provided with some information about potential side effects with those already approved drugs, you see a long list of side effects. So don't get discouraged by those. It's just we want to make sure that you are informed of potential side effects, because we want to work with you closely. And the same situation is happening in clinical trials. We want to make sure that we have a really, really engaged study participant that is willing to work with us, so we can provide the best care that we can when you participate in the clinical trial. And that means having really good communication channels where you can reach out to your study nurse or your study doctor and ask questions that you might have. One of them, again, being the risk. So what I will suggest that when you get this information is just focus on what is the most common side effects, and then try to understand out of percentage of patients, how many of those patients might experience those side effects for you to really grasp and understand what's involved from the risk point of view. So it's, if, for example, I tell you 10% of the patients will experience low blood counts with this drug, then you will understand that, again, potentially your risk of having this side effect is of those 10 patients out of 100 patients experiencing it. And how severe this side effect could be, then in oncology we use gradings, so we will find grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, or they will give you some ranges for you to understand what it means to you in terms of the severity of those side effects. So put those two together to try to understand the potential risks that you might face. And all, of course, there's going to be some risks that we don't even know that could happen, and this is what is important, that you have close communication with your study team. So this is just an example of the schedule of events. It's a busy slide, but what I tried to do with this slide is just to show you a table that usually these days I see a lot of informed consent forms having it in it. What it tells you what is required from you and at what time points, like at screening, during the baseline assessment, once you start treatment, at the end of the treatment, and what sort of tests are going to be done or assessments are going to be done throughout your participation in the study. We try to keep at least our side table with this information because, again, we appreciate that it's very complex, trial these days, the design of a trial, and it's hard for a study participant to remember all what they need to do, what tests they need to have done, appointments, diary cards. It's a lot of information. So always rely on the information that is provided to you in the informed consent form throughout this table. Some other consents might actually have a narrative with describing exactly what you need to do at each time point of your study participation. So what's important here, and again, these are just other components of the consent form. So there's also a section where we dedicate to have reminders and responsibilities for our study participants, because we want to make sure that this is a win-win situation for our patients, but also for our research. We want to make sure that what we are doing later on can help other patients, but also can help the regulatory submission of a new drug and the approval process as well. So we want to do really be in compliance with the requirements of the protocol. So we want to work with our patients. And sometimes if we don't have the opportunity to discuss some potential challenges that you might face, if you decide to participate, then your participation in the trial might not be successful. For example, if you need to go to the hospital because you need to get injections for the drug, but you don't have the resources to go to the hospital, you don't have somebody who can drive you, or those are sort of the discussions and topics that you need to have with your research team. We try to help as much as we can. Usually there are resources available to support your participation. We appreciate that a financial burden is a big one to carry if you are participating in a clinical trial. If on top of that you're also going through a journey in your disease. So it is important that you explore those. But this information is also in the consent form and is there for you to also remember throughout your study participation. So I have patients that sometimes they forget that they might be reimbursed for transportation or for meals or for any other sort of time involved with their participation, and they are not asking those questions, and they miss an opportunity to have some support that will facilitate their participation in the clinical trial. Again, so this is where we talk about the cost and reimbursements and other rights. So when you are provided with care, and here in Canada through our system, you are not expected to pay for your participation in clinical trial. So if there's some need for you to also be admitted to the hospital, so care will be provided to you. And this is some, again, approaches that we'll have in finances that we'll be looking at when we discuss with the study funder to make sure that, again, the participation of a clinical trial in a clinical trial for patients is supported. So considerations that you have to keep in mind, again, when you make decisions about participating in a clinical trial. You also, of course, might have, through your participation, so other questions that you could have, ethical questions, how all this study is being conducted, something that you might not consider that is being done properly. You can always raise those ethical concerns to the Research Ethics Board. Again, I mentioned to you, it's a group of people in our institution where the study is being conducted that look after the welfare of the study participants and making sure that patients are treated ethically and through all, meeting the requirements from the three council policy for them to participate in the trial. So you can always contact your Research Ethics Board, and that could be anonymously, and they will keep it confidential. But again, some patients don't know that they have the right to contact the Research Ethics Board in case they have any questions, specifically ethical questions about how the study is being conducted on a specific site. Okay, so just we're going to move through the last couple of topics in the talk. So what I would like to is, again, remember at the beginning when I mentioned, considering your participation or participating in a clinical trial is almost like a journey as well. So we went and spent some minutes specifically on the informed consent process, which is, again, now probably you decided to participate in the trial. So what's in there after for you, or what is expected from you? So once you decided to participate in a clinical trial, we're going to go through the screening and eligibility process. So the screening is just pretty much all the assessments and procedures and tests that we need to perform to make sure that it's safe for you to participate in the trial, and also that you meet the eligibility criteria for you to be able to participate in the clinical trial. And before we are screened, and again, in order for you to be part of a screening process, we need to have a consent form in place. We need to have your consent. We talk about pre-screening activities, and not necessarily a consent is required when, investigators or clinicians, they kind of look into medical charts or in their patients, and they try to identify who might benefit potentially from participating in a clinical trial or doing some research. And this doesn't involve talking to you directly. So we just review and see if pre-screen again and see if somebody might be potential candidate to participate in a clinical trial. And usually it's your clinician, your attending physician, the person who will come to you and say, and I was just telling David right now, when do I know that, I probably should consider a clinical trial participation? And that's a good question, because usually throughout your myeloma journey, you're going to have milestones where you're going to have to start new treatment or consider other options of treatment. So let's say if you're just starting the myeloma journey and you're just newly diagnosed, this is a good opportunity for you to ask about options in clinical trials. So we do have, of course, a standard of care treatment. And if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about what other options of treatment are besides the standard of care for you newly diagnosed disease, myeloma in this case, that's a good opportunity for you to ask about clinical trials. And throughout your journey, you know that unfortunately we don't have a cure, but we try to control the disease and keep it in remission for as long as we can. So when you know that the disease is becoming active again, this is another opportunity for you to ask about what other options we have as part of being in a clinical trial to treat your myeloma at this stage of the journey. So those are kind of good stages in the journey where you can ask about participation in clinical trial. So going back to the screening, so again, we do check on this eligibility criteria because we want to make sure that it is, again, safe for patients to participate, but also that they are kind of meeting For consistency, the group that we want to study, the participants that we want to make sure that are receiving the intervention and they have almost the same kind of exposure or environment or conditions that will help interpret the data that or the information that we learn from doing the research. So as part of the eligibility criteria, we look into the inclusion criteria, as mentioned before, and Dr. Chen also mentioned it. It could be very picky. So again, don't be discouraged if you don't meet eligibility at that point. Your research team will help you understand and work with you in case other tests, they need to be repeated, confirm eligibility criteria later on. Sometimes we have to wait for a little bit of time to get some of the conditions that a patient might be experiencing that precludes them to participate in a clinical trial to improve, let's say, blood counts, for instance. And then we have the exclusion criteria, which is intended, again, to potentially identify those patients that might be at increased risk or that we don't want to kind of involve in the clinical research because we might consider that it might not be safe or standardized criteria for them to participate. Other considerations that as a patient going through a screening process you need to be aware of is just the standard of care assessments. We need to, and for the most part, we try to avoid repeating tests and assessments that you already have done, especially imaging, like a skeletal survey, an MRI. So we work with the sponsors of the protocol to make sure that within the eligibility criteria there is built some time frame that allows you to have a window that allows you to use the same blood work or tests that have been done on you as part of the standard of care. So don't be afraid to ask and work with your clinical research team and say, I have done this test, do I need to repeat it? Or how often I need to do this test? Or I have this test done last week, the blood work, can we use that one? I had my bone marrow aspirate done 30 days ago. Is it possible not to repeat that? Sometimes, even if the eligibility criteria doesn't allow, we can still reach out to the sponsors and ask for opportunities to work around that as much as we can. Of course, we got to understand that the eligibility criteria tends not to be that flexible because it's intended to make sure that we work with patients that are most fit to tolerate the treatment. Now, once you have passed, and again, I forgot to mention, the screening process is again a process. It could be held in one single visit, depending on the complexity of the trial, depending on the design of the trial, or it might require multiple visits at the site and collecting some information. But once you have been confirmed that you're eligible to participate in the clinical trial, the next step in the journey is enrolling the study participant actually in the trial. And so the enrollment is just like it says, it's the process of registering or entering a patient into a clinical trial. And we want to make sure that at that point, everybody is in agreement and understands that at that point, we're going to start, our participation in the clinical trial starts, and then we are expected to comply with the requirements of that protocol. The randomization as part of the enrollment is just the process of assigning trial subjects to investigational treatments or interventions or control groups, using an element of a chance to determine the assignments in order to reduce the bias. So we don't know what treatment a patient might be offered. Let's say if it's a phase 3 trial, which is usually, for the most part, where we use randomization. Again, these days, the complexity of the design for the clinical trials allows phase 2 trials also to have randomization components in it. But an example of randomization is those randomized clinical trials or phase 3 trials where you have a comparator arm, as I mentioned to you before, a standard of care treatment, and we want to test a new one. And we don't know how that will be allocated. So it's randomly, a computer does it, and then you are selected or you are given a specific treatment arm. In terms of the enrollment process, these days is very sophisticated. When I started, usually the enrollment process, we completed the eligibility checklist, and then we submit that to or fax it to the sponsor, and then they'll review and assess and make sure that the patient or the potential participant meets all the criteria, and then we will confirm. You got a question for me?
I'm just curious, doesn't the screening process make the procedure biased?
Say that again, sorry.
When you actually screen the person, doesn't that add bias into the process?
If I added bias? You could think about that because, again, you are selecting your participants, but precisely because you want to make sure that it is safe for the patient. So technically, yes, when you compare data from clinical trials, it's different from what we see from the real world data that we compare. But these days, we are actually doing studies using real world data as well, because we are learning that actually real environment and conditions might alter what we have learned from a specific clinical trial. But I think, again, as research is evolving, we're learning more from that, and I think we're incorporating already, again, real world data, which is intended to, again, clarify those potential bias when we enroll only patients, so sure. So that's a good point. Again, so these days, we use sophisticated systems, interactive voice recognition systems like the nurses can use to just enroll the study participants. There is also, not necessarily randomization, but there are some treatment ratios kind of that are assigned based on certain conditions. So for instance, the staging of the patient who has been enrolled into the clinical trial might be a condition or a variable that they will look into at enrollment to make sure that you get the specific arm. Let's say if we're talking with David, if you are a patient who have renal impairment, and we know that the medication that you're going to be given as part of a clinical trial might have some impact on your renal function, there might be some considerations at the time of enrollment as part of the study design for you to be allocated an arm that might not have the same dosage of the medication as if you didn't have an impairment, renal impairment. So those are considerations that are also taken part during the enrollment process when you're being considered for a clinical trial. Now, once you are enrolled, then we move into the baseline component of a clinical trial. So this is anything that has happened or it is happening to you before we start the study treatment, let's say the intervention or study drug. So why we have really this visit, or why it's so important to have the baseline visit, is just because it's going to give you a status of the study participant's health condition and disease after screening and enrollment. So it will tell us, in other words, we're trying to assess safety and efficacy when we do a clinical trial. So if I don't know what is your health condition at baseline before we start giving you the treatment, then it will be very difficult for me as a research team know if any of the potential side effects that now you're experiencing or adverse events might be related to the intervention that we're giving them. So let's say if you are a patient with diagnosis of hypertension and you're taking medication, some of the medications, again, if not all of them, will have some adverse events or side effects. So we need to make sure that we have documented that and we can start measuring what we want to measure, whether it's some efficacy or safety variables from that baseline. So that is why it's important that we communicate with our clinical research team. We let them know specifically what kind of medications we're on, what other conditions we've been diagnosed with and that we've been treated for. So there is proper documentation on that information. And then remember when I mentioned to you about the risk in oncology and in clinical trials, we look at different grades of an adverse event, whether it's low blood counts, depending how low, we are talking about grade 1, grade 2, and so on. Same thing when we are documenting and assessing clinical trials participants, we want to make sure what grade are those side effects. And a patient that might, again, be dealing with high blood pressure might have some sort of symptoms like headache, but based on the scales that we use, we know it's grade 1. And when we start giving you the study drug, then your headache actually got worse. So if we didn't have this baseline visit, we wouldn't know if the actually headache that you got worse might not be present at the time that or before we started the treatment for you. So it is really, really important visit. And also, it is important because during this visit we establish where your disease, in this case myeloma, is at. Whether it's for a newly diagnosed myeloma patient, where we know, again, and probably this is from the talk that Anoop had last time about myeloma, the basics of myeloma, how we probably assess response in myeloma, all these markers that we use, all these different tests, the bone marrow, the urine collections, all these tests, and will tell us where your disease is at. And when we do the efficacy of the drug or the new intervention, we look at those and see if you start responding or your myeloma start responding to that treatment. And that's what is important also to have this baseline visit just for those assessments that we want to objectively evaluate. Now, again, after you have the baseline visit and now you start your treatment, it is important that you are aware of what is required from you during your participation and after you finish receiving the study drug as part of the follow-up. So during the monitoring and your study participation, we're going to perform all the assessments, tests, procedures that are required to be in compliance with the protocol. And this is where I like to stress how important. I remember when I used to, again, work with patients, and these days I see the complexity of the trials, and I like to, in the past, work with the study participants, but together, developing a calendar, and in a calendar I used to put all the requirements and the visits, the appointments, a lot of things that we need to go through to make sure that we're in compliance and that the trial is successful, not only for the study participants, but for future patients as well. And it's challenging because, again, these days there's so much complexity and what is required from patients. But again, your research team is there to help you. So don't be afraid to ask for those tools, for those resources, a calendar, a diary card where you document your pill intake, your side effects. Keep a journal, keep a diary. It usually helps for you to have your notes and remember things. Because let's say if you're taking an oral medication as part of your treatment and you're not seeing your research team every week or regularly, you're gonna forget. And when we need to meet for your assessment before you start, let's say, the next cycle of part of your treatment, it's going to be challenges if you don't remember, and we tend to forget things. So take notes, be engaged with your own care, take ownership of your own care. I think that's something that I do appreciate, and I used to appreciate when I was coordinator for a trial, because it really makes things easy for everybody, for the study participant to feel engaged, to feel reassured, to feel that they're taking control of their care, and be proactive and work together when you identified challenges. And again, other team members, so work with them as well. So again, your key contact person, I will say, is your dedicated clinical research nurse or study coordinator to develop those tools. But keep in mind that you're going to be interacting with other different people within a hospital. Let's say, dedicated nurses collecting extra samples, we call them PK nurses, technicians performing other sort of tests like electrocardiograms, or imaging technicians performing X-rays, MRIs, CT scans, PET scans. So it is important that when you have the opportunity to talk to them, if you have any questions, you ask those questions. And have an ongoing and proactive communication with your research team. Again, these days, technology is really, really helpful. Having the opportunity to reach out to your research team via email, phone calls. Our team is really, really focused, centered, in a patient-focused center, and then we tend to communicate with our cell phones, so our coordinators really, really establish good relationships with team members and with participants, so they're kind of the center point of view. And it is important because sometimes in the health system, to navigate the health system is challenging as a patient, and you think, oh, probably being a clinical study participant, it will be even worse. And I like to say that it's a little bit different. I think you have a dedicated, really committed team, and when you have that, it's easy to navigate through the system because, again, you have a dedicated personal contact that you can reach to. And be mindful of course, the scheduled appointments that are booked in advance. Review them on a regular basis. I put the example of a calendar because it really helps. So I remember having extra time put into a calendar that I used to give to a patient, where I put as much information as the patient needed to make sure that they were in compliance with the trial, make sure that they understand what is expected from them. And of course, your other tools are your consent form. You're going to be given at the end of the consent process. When you sign the consent, you're going to be given a copy of that document. Use it, keep it in a place that is easy to access for you. Just don't put it away because you say, oh, I signed that, I don't need that. No, this is a document that you're going to use a lot. And again, in it, there is a lot of information that you can go back and refer to when you have questions, when you forget what is expected for me in cycle 1, day 1. Look at the schedule of event in the table and in the consent form. But again, don't be afraid to reach out to your clinical research team. So this is in terms of the participation of a study participant throughout the clinical trial. So once you finish, and that's the next slide, the end of the trial, but once you go through the participation in the clinical trial, there are follow-up visits as well that you need to be aware. They're not necessarily intended to be, or your visits in the hospital or with your research team are not necessarily always to receive treatment. Sometimes you need to go because we need to assess other variables, other aspects of the clinical trial, questionnaires, a service about your quality of life at home. Sometimes we're involving healthcare care providers too, relatives and friends in our research because we want to learn on the burden of them to participate, for them to provide care and also for their loved ones to be participating in a clinical trial. And so that's with regards to your participation in a clinical trial. Other components that I mentioned to you is other tools that you need to be aware of, and this is again a challenge because some tests require extra commitment from our patients, and for instance, one of them is the collection of the 24-hour urine samples is challenging, especially if you are collecting those for 24 hours and then you are not necessarily at home, or if you need to bring them back to the site. Sometimes it is key and important to have those tests done because in order for us to provide data that supports efficacy for a new drug, we need to have objective ways to measure the disease response to a clinical trial or a new drug. And if we don't have all these variables being provided as part of the data, then there is less and less chance that, let's say, the results of a trial can be used to support regulatory approval of a new drug. So when you understand this, then it's easy for you to say, you know what, now I understand why I have to collect this 20 urine sample, even though it's a hassle to collect it, I understand why. And then you become more engaged and proactive about that. But if you don't understand why you've been asked to do things, then it's easy for you to forget. And again, that might not help you, and that might not help other study participants. So it's important to always understand why we asked to do certain things. Now, the other component is once you have completed the treatment or what happens at the end of the treatment, I wanted to kind of have 3 different case scenarios that could happen for you not to have more participation in a trial or not, or stop taking the, let's say in this case, the intervention, the study drug. So the end of the trial is when the trial has been completed as is been written in the protocol. So after 12 cycles of therapy, the study participants will come off the study drug and we'll follow them for 6 months, and then that's it. So you completed those 12 cycles of treatment, you're followed for those 6 months, and now that's it. You completed the trial is done, you don't need further information from you, your trial is completed. There is nothing else that we require from you. There is another case scenario where it's an early termination of the trial, and this could be mainly reasons associated with the sponsors or regulatory agencies' decisions. So usually because the objectives and endpoints were met early than expected. We have seen those cases, especially in phase 3 trials, where we see the comparator arms and the treatment arm, the research arm, seen a big difference in, let's say, in the endpoint or the outcome that we're measuring, and sometimes that actually gives us, whether it's good or bad. Good in the sense that we've seen, wow, the treatment arm, it's so amazing that we want to accelerate the approval of this drug. We have seen overall survival impact. Let's just get into the approval of this drug. Or the other way where we see, unfortunately, the results are not what we expected, there are safety concerns, and we cannot keep our study participants receiving the intervention because we know it's not safe. We have received some signals that it's not safe, so we're going to stop. And then it's usually, again, the sponsors and the regulatory agencies that make those decisions. We communicate that to our study participants, and then we move into what is required for the early termination. And then the other case scenario approach will be when you as a study participant decided for one or another reason that you don't want to continue participating in the clinical trial. And then again, as you recall, one of the principles of the consent form is that your participation in the trial is totally voluntary. And that could be throughout your participation. So even if you're going halfway through and then for some reason you decided not to participate, you have the right to come off the trial. But of course, as a research team, we would like to understand what is happening. Why are you making this decision? Why you're not willing to continue with the trial if we're not terminating it yet? Because before that happens, of course, we want to have a conversation where we can see and try to help you if it's challenges that you're experiencing and, I don't have the financial resources to continue participating in the trial. It's really expensive for me to have my expenses for transportation going to the sites 4 times or 2 times during the week is challenging. I don't have, financial constraints, or I don't have anybody who can take me to the hospital, and I don't have the proper support to attend. It's a big burden to me. Or I just don't want to keep providing more samples for my bone marrow. I think everything is under control. I don't want to do this. Of course, you want to avoid this to happen, and that's why it's important at the beginning, have those clear conversations with a potential study participant, because it is important that, yes, as I mentioned before, you could see it as an opportunity to have another options of treatment. Sometimes, again, it is important that we also understand from a patient perspective that we are responsible not only for ourselves, but for other patients who might benefit from the research that we're doing. And if we don't complete that, that poses risk with the integrity of the data or the data that we want to use to support approvals. But again, this is your right, and you can, again, exercise that right. And if you decide after we having all these conversations that's how you want to, that's what you want to do, then we'll respect the decision and we'll support you in that decision and help you navigate through the requirements of the end of treatment evaluations. So after you're discontinued from the trial because you completed the trial, because the study was terminated early, or because you decided to withdraw from the trial, it's important that you ask as a patient, ask yourself a question: what is going to happen with my treatment? Are we supposed, or I'm supposed to get more treatment? I decided not to continue treatment because a reason completely different from you not tolerating the study medication, but you would like to have access to the study drug. Or what happens if the study terminated because the treatment cycle is completed, but I'm benefit from the treatment and my attending physician, a study doctor, might consider continuing with me on the treatment. Do I have that option? So it is important that you always think about, okay, once I complete the trial, what is there for me? What are options I'll have in case I need to secure access to the drug that I've been receiving as part of a clinical trial. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some, again, processes or approaches that are in place to precisely bridge those gaps. So when we talk about rollover studies, are just continuing the study that happens after you complete a treatment as part of a scheduled protocol or a defined protocol. And then there is an opportunity for those benefiting from the study treatment to continue later on. Sometimes we do see that the sponsor might have designed a protocol that allows you to, let's say if we're talking about a phase 3 trial where you have a comparator arm with, or treatment arm with the standard of care arm, and then you were allocated to the standard of care arm, but once you stop receiving benefit from the standard of care arm, there is a possibility for you to roll over to the comparator arm or research arm, where we have seen again that probably patients are responding to the treatment. It is safe for the patients to respond to be taking the medication or the new treatment, and then allows you to move into getting the medication that you were not given at the randomization point during the enrollment for you to get access to. So that's kind of the rollover study. So ask about that. Usually in phase 3 trials, when you have this standard of care arms as a competitor, ask that question out. Would I be able to get the study drugs if I don't get the arm? When that will happen? Will that be after I finish my treatment as part of the trial, or during, or not at all? Because that sort of information will make you informed and probably help you make the decision whether you want to participate. Okay?
By standard of care arm, is that like what you talked about? Is that placebo?
No, so that's a good question. So your question is about if when we talk about standard of care arms, we talk about placebos. So at the beginning, I mentioned that in oncology it's really, really rare that we use placebo, because we are in a setting where we want to give our patients at least what it is considered approved, or we call it a standard of care, to treat that condition at that stage of their journey of the disease. So it's very difficult, it will be almost unethical to give you a sugar pill, a placebo, knowing that there is a specific treatment available for you, for your condition, that could, again, treat your condition, just for us to learn if the other comparator arm is effective, in treatment of the disease. Almost close to none. Yeah, that's right. So we tend to compare with those treatments that are already approved for the indication at that stage of the disease. So you're welcome. And so those are kind of the rollover studies. You move from one trial to another one to get access to the drug that you didn't have access to. Or if you were benefiting from it, to let you continue with that. Well, we have now 2 special or compassionate access programs, let's say through Health Canada, for those study drugs that now have been approved. Within the Health Canada system, it takes some time from having Health Canada approve a study drug and then having the province funding the study drug for reimbursements, or for you to be able to use it as a patient. It could be gaps up to 2 years. So what is happening is, from a drug that has been approved to the time that the province funds the drug, the pharmaceutical company can have compassionate access programs that allows the clinicians to provide access to those to those drugs, because now they are approved, to their patients, while we're waiting for the approval process for reimbursement, for funding at the provincial level. So talk to your clinicians again about that, because again, we know that there could be a gap, so patients could benefit from having access to these programs. They used to be very small numbers of patients. They have to go through a selection process and eligibility criteria through the company, providing the access, compassionate access. But our clinicians, I work with them, they are very, very diligent in making sure that they try to secure access for the patients while we're waiting for the approval. And we have expanded access programs that also, again, for marketed and sometimes approved drugs that we require, or we need to have more safety or efficacy data being collected. And a way to do that is through providing access to those expanded access programs. So again, try to bridge the gap between funding and approvals. And funding at the provincial level, the companies might say, okay, Health Canada has requested that in addition to provide compassionate access to the patients for this new drug, we collect some more data that will help us understand in a real-world setting how things are happening with these patients. So those could be the expanded access programs. Or phase 4 programs or post-marketing studies are those that, again, we have the drug approved, it's given it's reimbursed by or funded by the province, but we want to learn something else from this drug and some post-marketing information like further safety and efficacy as well. And then, we just collect more data, but the medication is approved. It's hard to enroll into these studies unless there is something else additional that might be there for you, for the patients, because if you get access to a drug already that is approved, what is in there for you to be part of the study, right? So whether you can actually get the same drug if you were not part of the study. So there is usually some added research component of those programs that allows us to gather and get more information or learn more from your participation in the trial. We're always trying to learn new things. So even on those expanded access programs, we're trying to get to learn more stuff. And as I mentioned before, this is just intended to bridge the approvals gaps and the reimbursements at the provincial level. And then finally, we just have the interim and final or manuscript reporting. So the interim reporting is through your participation. We get from the pharmaceutical companies or the sponsors updates on efficacy and safety. So if we see safety concerns, we have to update the consent form, inform our study participants of the new concerns that we have identified and decide whether it's good or not for you to continue participating in the study. Or we have seen some issues about efficacy and we say that, there is no activity, and that's another reason for sponsors to say, we don't want to continue investing people's time, efforts in this study or this drug because we don't see any activity. Let's terminate the trial. So that could be as an interim reportings. But once the study is being finalized and conducted, then we talk about the final or manuscript report for publication. And this is when the sponsor collects all the data is cleaned up and then analyzed, and then we produce a report and we understand if we met the objectives of the studies through measuring the endpoints and then what we have learned from the research. It is a very, very, very technical document. So this is not something that we share with the study participants, but I like to say that there are new initiatives at the research centers. For instance, at Princess Margaret, we have now a process where we translate in lay language that manuscript, those results, into a single or two-page document with very, very easy to understand language that is intended to reach patients, their friends, and their relatives, explaining what we learned from the study, what are the results. So again, talk to your research team, whether it's at Princess Margaret or other site where you are participating, if you're participating in a clinical trial, about the results. Don't be afraid to ask for those results. What did we learn about my participation in the clinical research? Can you share those results with me? And this is, again, it takes proactivity from you as a patient, as a potential study participant, because sometimes, you might not have those results available to you while you participate in the trial, but later on. So I had a patient, I remember, she did come to me after 2 years after we finished, and they were at different stages in their journey, and they came to me and they said, can you share the results of the trial that we purchased? Of course, so to me it was very, very rewarding to see how much a patient could be engaged in their care and learn so much. So that's in terms of the final results. So again, ask for those. Ask your clinician, your attending physician, to share those with you. Now, in summary, so talk to your care providers and support group about clinical trials if you're interested. Do not be afraid to ask questions. Be engaged and proactive during the informed consent process. And after the informed consent form is signed, remember there is an ongoing process and you can ask questions throughout your participation and change your mind as well. Involve your family, your friends, and other doctors looking after you when you are making decisions whether you want to participate or not in a clinical trial. And while you're participating in a clinical trial as well, there are great resources to support you, to help you understand when you go to a visit. It's challenging. It's a lot of information. Like right now, a lot of information that you get in from me is hard to assimilate. When you get home, you're like, what did the doctor say? What did the coordinator say? I forgot about this. I didn't take my notes. So it's challenging. But if you go with somebody else, whether it's a friend, a relative, you know, they're there to support you. They will ask questions. I like to, as much as I can. I just came back from Colombia, and I was attending my mom's appointments with her and my dad and trying to be engaged and ask questions. Same thing, you know, ask the same from the people that you want to bring to the clinic. I know space is limited, but now that we're going back on site and, you know, in person, so it's important that at least you bring somebody that you can trust, that you can ask questions later on in case you forget or you didn't understand. Use tools that help you understand your commitment. It's a commitment that you're making when you're participating in a clinical trial, because what I just mentioned to you, the impact that you're going to have, hopefully is a positive impact on future patients. And so your commitments are really, really important, but it is complex. It's complex when you participate in a trial. There's so much information that if you have key tools that allow you to be reminded of what are your commitments are and what you need to do on this date, on that day, what do I need to bring this and where, it is really helpful. So calendars, diary cards, appointments for tests or surveys, have them, you know, flagged. Talk to your research team. We're there to help you, really, to work with you. And you may not have direct benefit from participating in a clinical research, but others will do in the future from your participation. So don't be afraid. We want you to be reassured. We want to work with you, but you want to have all the tools and information necessary for you to make that very important decision in your myeloma journey. So with that in mind, I just want to, again, thank you all. These were just the objective at the beginning. I hope I have gone through them, I have achieved them. And I want to give, again, the opportunity to have any questions from you. So thank you very much for your time. That's okay.
Concerning the standard of care, when you go into a clinical trial, concerning standard of care arm or the research arm, does one have the choice when you go into the trial to choose which arm you want to go into?
That's a good question. So when the question is if you're considering standard of care versus a comparator arm trial, these days, because of what I mentioned to you, the complexity of the trials, in the past I would say, you know, those are phase 3 trials where randomization, so in other words, the allocation to your treatment is random, so we don't have a saying of that. It's a computer or machines, you know, saying you're going to get the standard of care, you're going to get the treatment arm or the research arm. So that's one situation. In phase 2 trials, we start seeing also randomization components in the protocol design, and in it, all the patients are going to get, let's say, the study drug, you see. Let's say they're going to get the study drug, right? So there is guarantee that every patient is going to get the study drug, but how they're going to get the study drug is what might change. So there will be an arm that might have a combination of the standard of care with the new drug. There might be the standard of care arm. There might be the standard of care arm plus the new drug plus another component of there. So, but depending on the phase of the trial, you might have access to the study drug that we are investigating, like phase 2 trials. Phase 3 trials, randomized trials, you don't get that option.
Phase 1, is it?
Phase 1, everybody gets the study drug, but at different dose levels, right? So it could be, we're exploring what's the safe dose to treat patients on a phase 2 trial. So we're interested in knowing more about the safety of the drug and the dose that is safe for us to use in a phase 2 trial.
Are there recent studies that you've gotten approval for?
Say that again, sir?
Are there recent studies that you have gotten approval for?
Within my group that I'm aware of, not necessarily, especially those investigator-initiated trials. We have worked on phase 2 trials. Phase 3 trials are difficult to conduct it as investigator-initiated trials because they cost so much and involve thousands of people. So usually they're industry-sponsored trials or network trials. So within our group right now, we don't have a current trial that has been probably approved, but we have participated on trials that have, supported the approval of new drugs for sure. Yes.
Using the myeloma research group as an example, what percentage of interventional trials are funded by industry?
That's a good question. With our group, based on our metrics, I will say that about 70% of our portfolio is industry-sponsored trials, and then 30% is about investigator-initiated studies or trials. We do have a lot of non-interventional, but that's the ratio that we keep, at least in our group, for sure. So about 70 to 30%.
I wanted to comment about one of your very last points about phase 4. I'm just checking my notes, see if I got this right. No, it was, sorry, I'm confusing two different points. There are a lot of really interesting stuff you said. Very good to translate stuff for patients.
Very good.
Very good to translate the results of trials for patients.
The
so
summary
I'm really
result.
delighted to hear that. I participated many, many years ago in a very early trial, very early in my diagnosis. And it was a very minor, I think phase 3, about the drug levels that with kidney involvement.
Okay.
And I always wondered about what the results
So in a
of that
phase
were.
1 trial, probably?
I think, yeah, it was somewhere.
Okay.
Anyway, it was not a big trial. But I always wondered about the significance of that. And I think for patients to know, you had made the point about it may not benefit us, but it may benefit other people. And, I always wondered about that. So I think it's really terrific that you are translating the results of trials for patients. So good on you.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Now, on the point that you raised very early on, I thought this was really interesting, was the point about therapeutic misconception.
That's right.
And I think we as patients are biased towards therapeutic misconception. How do you, as a clinician, help us to work that through? Because we think, okay, we're going to go on a trial, we're going to get a better drug, and we're going to benefit from it, right? That's therapeutic misconception, right?
That's right.
So how do we break through that sort of, because maybe it will benefit us.
That's right. That's a good point, Patrick. So Patrick is just alluding to the fact that the therapeutic misconception is something that I wanted to raise aware, for instance, but also how clinicians or research groups can support and make patients understand or not fall within having a therapeutic misconception if they decided to participate in a clinical trial. So it's a good point because I like to think that in the dedicated academic centers, we pay a lot of attention into what kind of research we're going to do. We want to avoid duplicate efforts. We want to work with protocols that we believe scientifically are sounded that we can probably implement in our group. There is a space for patients to potentially benefit from it. But we want to make sure that also you as a potential study participant have those conversations with your attending physician, with your nurse team or research team, because the reality is we don't know. So and that's what we're studying. We're trying to learn that from doing clinical trials. So when you're doing clinical trials, we hope that what we provide as an intervention is something that scientifically we have evaluated and seen that based, again, on other studies being conducted on the same molecules or therapies, that we think that they're going to help. But truly, until the study is completed, we don't know what the study will show. So we cannot lie to you as a potential patient saying, yes, you're going to benefit from it. And this is where it's clarity, there should be clarity from us indicated. And I remember when I used to consent patients, I always make sure that I emphasize on that, saying, you might not benefit from this trial, we hope, because again, that's where we truly, we hope, everybody hopes, but we cannot assert that that's going to be the case until we see the result. So it's important that patients understand that they might not be benefit from them if they participate. What I can definitely tell you from experiences in the future, your participation in the trial, whether the outcome is favorable or not, will help us learn and develop potentially new protocols or therapies that will help other patients in the future for sure.
On that point, isn't it true that most of the Canadian studies or trials that are done have already been done in the US and have already, they already know in the US if it's going to be effective or not effective, and most of the trials here are just repeats, but because of our system, we have to go through that same process as the US has gone through, and they already know what the results are going to be, if they're going to be effective or not effective, how much effective, what percentage, so on and so forth. Isn't that very often mostly the case here?
To a certain point, because again, let's say Health Canada as a regulatory agency assessing or reviewing a new application for a new drug will require, of course, phase 3 trials to support that regulatory approval. What happens is sometimes the research is going a little bit ahead of in the States. Let's say there's more studies being conducted, let's say phase 1 trials started being developed a little bit earlier than they were probably proposed to be conducted here in Canada. And then we started learning about that new molecule or a new drug. And then in different phases of the trial, phase 1 trials and the different indications. Usually we start with relapsed refractory multiple myeloma because we have exhausted other treatments for a new molecule. And then as the research evolved, and more information we're gathering from other ideas, other protocols will come using the same drug in different combinations, in different stages of the disease to try to learn. Ultimately, the phase 3 trials is what we require for regulatory approvals. And usually for those, we participate in phase 3 trials at Princess Margaret that are being conducted at the same time in the States or in Europe, for instance. So we are part of those phase 3, and it's not necessarily later on. So we've been part of potentially the same drugs. It's just the regulatory approval is independent. So it might be earlier in the States, but once we have, again, the phase 3 trials, we'll be able to have go through the regulatory approval by Health Canada. But we've been part of clinical research that is being conducted at the same time for a phase trial in the States or Canada or Europe.
Right. But I just, from what I understand from that many of the drugs that are, not even approved here yet have already been approved in the U.S. For example, CAR-T, it's already approved in the U.S. and here it's still in a clinical, study.
We have some approvals, but yeah, so it's again, depending on the sponsor might decide where they want to start the approval process. And again, if a lot of the participating sites are in the States, I will probably say that it's a good way to start your regulatory approval through the FDA. And sometimes happen the same time with Health Canada, but again, it depends on the sponsor in this case a pharmaceutical company, where they want to start the regulatory process and the type of data that they want to have in place in order to have the approval process in a given jurisdiction, like Canada or Europe. Or
Also, one more last point. When you said in the phase 3 trials, it's random standard of care or the drug. Do you tell the patients after, the participants after, which, what they have been in, or while they're going through the treatment? Do you tell them, or you don't tell them and you tell them after, or do you not tell them at all?
So that's a good question. It all depends on the design of the randomized trial. So if this is a single blinded study, it's a double blinded study. So if it's a single blinded study, let's say the patient might not know what they receive. If it's a double blinded, the patient and the investigator might not know what they receive. But we also have open label phase 3 trials where you know what medication you're getting. You're randomized to this arm, you're randomized to this arm, and you know what treatment you're getting into each arm. So you could know, even on a phase 3 trial, from the get-go, which treatment are you being allocated after being randomized as part of the phase 3 trial.
Okay, it's 4:30, folks. We're going to have to tidy up the room quite soon. So, Gio, if it's okay for you, I think we just have time for one more question.
Okay.
Yes. Anybody?
I think
Yes.
so.
Erica.
This is maybe a little bit futuristic type of question about how AI is going to, artificial intelligence is going to affect clinical trials. They hopefully will decrease the cost, maybe with decrease in personnel and maybe phone apps and things like that. But how else is artificial intelligence going to affect clinical trials?
That's a good question. I wish I'd had the answer. I think we're learning. I think this is very, very concurrent. I think we're trying to figure out ways to help, for sure, but also ways to not to have artificial intelligence potentially negatively impacting clinical trials. And from the patient's perspective, it's always about personal health information, privacy, how we can make sure that we are protecting study participants from the privacy, confidential participation in clinical trials. And I see opportunities with artificial intelligence potentially to, again, if we keep that into consideration, to also have these tools to support our study participants as a way to maintain them informed, to streamline processes like the consent process itself, to make sure that they are used as tools to remind study participants of their commitment or what's required. As I said to you, for us it's very challenging sometimes to understand the complexity of a trial. Imagine a study participant trying to navigate through it and what's expected from them. So I hope AI will become really a positive impact from that perspective that allows a patient participating in a clinical trial of a study participant to have those resources to reassure them to have the information that they need to have available to them concurrently, right away, and also for ways to, again, like the summary at the end of the trial, to use those to translate into, again, a lay language that allows you to understand the results that have been produced. Those examples of where we can use artificial intelligence, but I think we're all learning. It's a new endeavor that we're getting into. It's exciting. It could be challenging, but I'm more excited about how we can use those tools. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Like, wow. Like, totally wow. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to invite Bob to say a few words to thank our speaker.
Thank you. Very quickly, before I thank the speaker, I want to just say as a myeloma patient that research and clinical trials are very important to us as patients and your caregivers and your families. Why I say that is we're able to live longer, productive lives. And that's all we can ask for at this point. I can tell you by personal experience that new drugs that have been approved is one of the reasons that I can tell you that I'm entering my 18th year of my journey. And you know, I've met people across Canada that have been in it longer than that. So research and clinical trials work. Where we have to get involved, and we will be this coming Tuesday, members, myself and other members of the steering committee will be going to Queen's Park. We're there to tell them who we are, what our journeys were, what we expect from the government and the opposition critics moving forward. CAR-T's treatments, I'm sure, will come up, and other things like, well, I won't get into it now, but more staff, et cetera, et cetera. So they do work. Doctor, this has just been an awesome, Gio, sorry, okay. This was just a great presentation, thank you. I want to thank you for taking time from your busy schedule. We know you're busy, away from your family and friends, the time it took to organize your slides and your presentation today. And with that in mind, there's a card here.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
And also I can tell you that Dave, on his next trip to Princess Margaret, will be hand-delivering a piece of Canadiana pottery by a very well-known artist. And that's our appreciation from the steering committee and all of the members of our patient support group. Thank you
both. I
so much.
really appreciate it. It's been an honor for me to be here today, for sure. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.